Okay.
Em primeiro lugar, eu queria agradecer a professora Dena Williamson, por ter aceito esse convite. Eu a conheci aqui em Salvador no ano passado, que ela é amiga da professora Amanda Norcross, que estava como professora visitante no programa de pós-graduação em Saúde, Ambiente e Trabalho. Eu a conheci rapidamente, é interessante o que ela estava fazendo em relação à tese dela de doutorado, e ela defendeu a tese de doutorado esse ano. A tese de doutorado dela se intitula Understanding Capacity Building Effort to Address Environmental Justice Concern. Por que eu propus isso? Né? Eu propus porque a gente tem apresentado no Brasil grandes desastres ambientais estão acontecendo, especialmente desde 2018 a 2020, com impactos profundos sobre o ecossistema e na vida das comunidades. Esses impactos, eles ocorrem de forma desproporcional entre comunidades brancas e negras aqui também. E as comunidades têm elaborado estratégias de proteção que têm sido foco de pesquisas conjuntas com as universidades na perspectiva da pesquisa participativa de base comunitária e de ciência cidadã. Ciência cidadã que já foi alvo aqui, inclusive, de uma das sessões. O objetivo dessa apresentação é apontar as possibilidades e as dificuldades identificadas para a realização de pesquisas conjuntas entre universidade e sociedade civil nessas comunidades, né? Dessas comunidades, a fim de promover a justiça ambiental. Então, a pesquisadora Dana, ela apresentará os resultados de seus estudos, que, claro, não vai dar tempo de apresentar todos os resultados do estudo, mas ela trabalha nessa perspectiva de fortalecimento, de que forma as comunidades enfrentam e quais são as dificuldades que elas têm enfrentado para enfrentar essa questão da justiça ambiental. Então, e as dificuldades, essas dificuldades que podem ser compreendidas e melhor compreendidas pela universidade nessa troca de saberes, e de que forma essas trocas de saberes podem estar trazendo perspectivas novas para reduzir essas injustiças ambientais. Então, o nosso programa de pós-graduação em Saúde, Ambiente e Trabalho, nós tentamos fazer essa sessão numa sexta-feira, que é onde a gente faz nossas sessões, mas por motivos de agenda a gente não conseguiu, então nós fizemos para agora, para quarta-feira. Também essa sessão, ela está imbuída no contexto do Congresso da Rede Brasileira de Cooperação em Emergências, que está acontecendo essa semana, desde domingo, e que tem discutido isso no sentido fortalecimento da pesquisa participativa de base comunitária, no sentido dos grandes desastres que estão acontecendo no mundo, e no Brasil em especial, e como isso afeta de forma diferente as comunidades, e de que forma, e de uma forma que representando e significando as injustiças ambientais que nos defrontamos. Então, a nossa... Seja muito bem-vinda, Dana. You are welcome, and I hope your presentation, it will be very useful and very bring effort for our fights now, okay?
Before passing the word to Dana, eu gostaria de agradecer as palavras de professora Rita, iniciar então esses seminários INCT IN-TREE Novos e Velhos Saberes, que é uma atividade continuada de extensão dos programas de pós-graduação do Instituto de Biologia, Ecologia aplicada à gestão ambiental, Ecologia teoria, aplicação e valores, microbiologia e biodiversidade e evolução. Hoje teremos a doutora Dana Williamson. Ela é uma pesquisadora da Agência de Proteção dos Estados Unidos, a EPA, baseada em Atlanta, e vai falar para nós sobre dois problemas interessantes, não é? Os quais um deles temos dado pouca atenção, que é a questão de justiça ambiental, quero dizer, em termos nacionais, e o outro é a questão da participação das comunidades, algo até que alguns, o próprio nosso INCT tem dado uma boa atenção a isso. Anyway, Dana, I would like to thank you for your availability to be with us. And I'll ask you to make a brief presentation of you. I think you are the person that is most able to do that. And then you can initiate your talk.
Well, good morning, everyone. And thank you so much for having me today. I'm really honored to be able to have the opportunity to share with you my research. So the acronym is ASPPH. That stands for the Association and Schools of and Programs of Public Health. I am an environmental health fellow hosted at the United States Environmental Protection Agency. And so the work that I'm sharing with you today is my independent research and is not affiliated with the US EPA. Much of this work is related to my dissertation work, and it was recently conducted when I was a doctoral student at Emory University at the Rollins School of Public Health in Atlanta. So today, from my presentation, I would like for you to be able to explain the importance of capacity in advancing environmental justice. I'll detail, and your takeaway should be able to list the principles of engagement as increasing categories of community involvement and communication. And you should also be able to identify commonly used activities to increase capacity and organize around environmental justice issues. I'll begin with some background about the field of environmental justice, which I will also reference as EJ. And next, I will discuss the focus of my research and community capacity building. And finally, I'll talk about the study focus and some implications of my findings, and then we can have an exchange and you can ask questions. So in my discussion today, I will introduce the terms environmental inequities, environmental racism, and environmental justice. And I want to make sure that everyone has a common understanding, so I will briefly highlight this topic. Environmental inequities are grounded in the unequal exposure of toxins, the lack of healthy infrastructure, poor water quality, food deserts, pollution, and there's so many more, but that's just to name a few. In the United States, Black, African American, brown, and low-income communities have worse health outcomes. And many of these health disparities are a result of and attributable to the differences in these environmental exposures that I detailed previously. These Black and brown and low-income communities have been intentionally targeted for all things that are unhealthy. And this is what environmental racism looks like. Environmental inequities are one of the numerous forms of injustice that has permeated the United States. And this has been happening all over the world for decades. And this has been brought back to the forefront and made us confront our issues and concerns as we navigate this pandemic of COVID. We navigate a pandemic of racism, and we navigate this pandemic of climate change. environmental racism is the under-resourcing and overburdening of low-income and communities of color. In the United States and around the world, this is a phenomenon that has been studied by experts for many, many decades, for more than 50 years. And these realities are often experienced more by low-income communities of color that reside in economically disadvantaged neighborhoods and are commonly a result of policy, economics, and issues related to equity and equality. So environmental justice embraces the principle that all communities are entitled to equal protection with housing, equal protection with transportation, energy, equal access and protection to clean water and clean air, access to healthy foods and healthy resources, and all things that can embody a healthy environment for the individual and for their communities. It is also the idea that community members have a right to participate in the decisions that affect their community, their health, and their lives. So in the literature, the topic of environmental racism, environmental justice, and environmental inequities have incited and caused people, as well as academics, to want to develop research studies and interventions to help communities. Responses to the many injustices of the environment, as well as the lack of equity and fairness, has also, in response, made people look at collaborative strategies to address these concerns. Also, to strengthen communities, and also collaborative strategies to advocate for policy and system and population environmental level change. Much of what is written in the academic literature on community health recognizes that these inequalities in health are often a result of power, the power relationship that affects the distribution of these resources, whether they're financial resources, economic development, but all healthy resources are related to who has the power. And so when you are trying to identify and allocate the resources and demand policy change or structural change, this requires a community to exercise power. So building capacity in communities is vital for addressing health disparities, enhancing power, and also addressing the environmental injustices happening in these communities. So capacity building, I wasn't finished there. So capacity building is something that is frequently cited in the literature, and many of the approaches that are used to address environmental challenges, strengthen community, and advocate for policy change. So why do I focus on capacity building? And specifically, you'll hear me reference community capacity. Well, there are many factors that contribute to health disparities that cannot be controlled by the individual. Instead, the focus needs to be on the community. And these changes require collaboration and collaborative problem solving to achieve the structural and policy changes. Community capacity and capacity building is an asset-based approach. This means that it focuses on community strengths that can be leveraged and raised up to bring about sustainable changes. It is one way of viewing the characteristics in a community that can be leveraged to solve these environmental justice problems. So in my research, I focus on capacity building to recognize the importance of community power. In my most recent journal article that I will discuss with you today, I focus on capacity building to understand how researchers are helping to redistribute this power within communities to address some of the most pressing and important environmental challenges and concerns. And I use community capacity theoretical framework. This is the theory that I use to guide my work. This community capacity theory is a social science academic framework. It's comprised of these 10 dimensions that represent the 10 community characteristics that you see on the screen. These are the specific characteristics that can be leveraged to solve collective problems. So the first is citizen participation, community history, community power, community values, critical reflection, leadership, networks, resources, sense of community, and skills. These are all components of capacity building. And I'll return to this model in a few slides ahead to provide more detail a little bit later. I also focus on community engagement. And in our discussion today, I will use the community engagement continuum as a framework for understanding the scope and the manner in which academic researchers engage with their targeted community to address these varying concerns. So according to the principles of community engagement, it's defined as a process of working together collaboratively. This relationship often involves partnership and coalitions to help mobilize and influence systems for changing policies and programs and practices. So the community engagement scale, as you can see on the screen, I've used this in my research also, and it consists of 5 increasing categories of involvement, from outreach to consult, to involve, collaborate, and shared leadership. And then there's a 6th category that I created through my work because I felt like that this was a category that was missing. And I call it community-led. This identifies specific strategies or specific engagement where a community is actually working together and does not necessarily rely on the expertise or the knowledge from an outsider, whether that be an outside academic or an outside program. And I'll detail each of these categories shortly. So the work that I will be referencing today is a systematic scoping review that was recently published in an invited special issue of the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health. This was published alongside other discussions of community-engaged research to promote environmental health and sustainability and community resilience. This was an article that was published just this past May. So in the following slides, I'll share more details about this particular work, and I'll report the findings from this systematic search and scoping review of community academic partnerships and community-led strategies to address environmental inequities related to toxic exposures in the United States over a 30-year period from 1986 to 2018. So in this work, I analyzed and queried 5 different databases from peer-reviewed journal articles detailing research that was conducted from 1986 to 2018. The 5 databases that I used were Environment Complete, and you may be familiar with most of these, Political Science Complete, PubMed, SocialIndex, and Web of Science. I wanted to choose these databases to represent diversity across different disciplines because my field is public health, but my field specifically is behavioral science, but there are many different ways in which academics talk about environmental justice, and many of those are not necessarily in the field of public health. So the time period that I chose was specifically 1986 to 2018. And I chose 1986 because this preceded a landmark publication in the United States that happened in 1987. It was the Toxic Waste and Race in the United States report. This was published, if you're familiar, by Dr. Robert Bullard, a very renowned scholar in the environmental justice field, and also referenced as the father of EJ. So I wanted to capture any research that was done prior to this landmark publication through over the course of 30 years through 2018. I also chose to limit my research to the English language and studies that were conducted in the United States, primarily because there is a different national history of racism and discrimination in the United States that is a little bit different than across the world. And so some of the racism that's experienced in the US is very much influences our governance and our policies, and it's a little bit different than some other countries. And so it would have been more complicated to disentangle these nuances. So I chose to limit this work to the United States, but we all know that environmental justice and environmental injustice and environmental inequities are happening everywhere, all over the world. And the search strings that I used across these databases to identify the key articles are also listed here. Community organizing, community mobilization, community empowerment, environmental policy change, environmental justice, health disparities, program evaluation, capacity, capacity building, and theory. So to be eligible for inclusion, a study had to focus on some type of mobilization or empowerment or community action around issues of air, land, and water. The article had to specifically identify environmental justice concerns that were related to air or land or water pollution. And the communities that were referenced in the articles needed to be identified as low income or marginalized, disenfranchised, minority, or a community of color to be included in the umbrella of environmental justice research and the topic of environmental justice that specifically looks at disproportionate, low income, and people of color being exposed more to the unhealthy things in our communities. So there were many articles that were excluded. And I won't detail all of these items, but the most important articles that were not included in this research were articles and studies that did not have any type of community action or community involvement from the academic researcher. This is a Prisma flow diagram that details the systematic data abstraction process for this scoping review. Again, as I detailed in the previous slide, there were 5 databases that were queried from peer-reviewed journals detailing research conducted over the past 30 years, from 1986 to 2018. And using the search strings from the previous slide across the databases, a total I started at 10,873 articles. These were the original number of articles that were identified. And after the application of my eligibility criteria and exclusion criteria, I reduced the articles to 58 articles that were included with this study. And so that's how I'll frame my study findings in moving forward. So again, it was a total of 58 studies that were included in this review. And this slide identifies the variation of concerns that were addressed. And as you can see here, the majority of articles discuss the concern of air pollution and air quality. And there were numerous articles that also addressed more than one listed pollution concern. Other articles identified hazardous waste, and very few articles referenced illegal dumping or water quality. So as I mentioned earlier, I use the community engagement continuum as a framework for understanding the scope and the manner in which researchers engage with their targeted community to address varying environmental concerns. The community engagement continuum, as I referenced previously, is combined of 5 levels of increasing categories of involvement and communication, and the 6th level was the level that I added. So here we will discuss each of these levels and categories of involvement. The very first one is referred to as outreach. This is the lowest on the scale of community engagement. The objective here is to provide information to the public based on information that the researcher deems important. There is very limited community involvement. Communication, as you can see with the dots, like this would be the researcher, communication about the particular article or the particular focus of their research only goes out. It's only in one direction, as you can see from these arrows. Information is provided to the community, but there is no input from the community. There's no engagement, there's minimal engagement and minimal conversation. In this example, the researcher directs all of the importance of the work. The second level of engagement is consult or consultation. There is more community involvement here, but you can see that the communication flows from one to the other, but it's more informative. The decisions and the ideas and the issues are usually identified with the researcher, and they share the information with the community and they coexist. The third level of community engagement is involve. This is the work with community that tries to understand the issues and the problems and involves and includes community in identifying the options for addressing concerns. And you can see that this represents an arrow that is in both directions, from the researcher to the community. This is better involvement. Communication flows in both ways. There is participation with communication, and there is more participation with the community on issues, and the two actually cooperate together. The next level of engagement is collaborate. So there's more community involvement here. Communication flow is bidirectional. And so you see from the researcher that it goes to the community, and then within the community, there's actually conversation. And so often the researcher might partner with and seek advice for some type of collective decision-making that's had around a particular concern. There's partnerships that happen here, and there's information that's exchanged where the solutions are developed together, and the entities form a bi-directional communication channel. This next level of engagement is shared leadership. And so here, relationships are bi-directional. However, the final decision-making is held at the community level. This also represents strong partnerships that have been formed through the research process. The final decisions are made at the community, and the entities not only coexist, but they actually have a sharing and leadership of whatever the concern is. There's collective problem solving that happens together with the community and the researcher. And this is often considered probably the optimal community academic partnership level, which in the literature is most likely referenced as community-based participatory research, or CBPR. So this would be the gold standard of CBPR research. And then the very last category that I felt was lacking in some of the research and lacking through this community engagement model, I added community-led because I wanted to identify the research that's actually happening at the community level. It is the vision and the priorities are established by the community, and the efforts are spearheaded by the community. and partnerships are built on that local strength within the community. So in this slide, I want to illustrate that more than half of the research studies in this particular review fell into these lower tiered community engagement continuum categories, from outreach to consult, to involve, to collaborate. And I have a gold star above the shared leadership, as this tends to be the optimal research that I mentioned previously. This is more the optimal research structure for community academic partnerships. But the red star that I have at community level is really taking ownership and is more of what I consider the optimal engagement structure for communities, because communities are actually leading this process, and it focuses on the community priorities. So this is a very dense and compact slide, but I want to walk you through it because I wanted to give you more of an understanding of what this community engagement continuum looks like in a research study. So I want to draw your attention to the words that are in the red circles, and we'll start at the bottom of the community engagement continuum with outreach. So with outreach, this is when information is provided to the community. An example of this would be where the data is merely gathered, a researcher comes into the community, takes the data, and then reports the data back to the community. That's the bare minimum level of community engagement. One step up is consultation. This is more driven by a particular research question in which the researcher wants to engage with the community and get feedback from the community. And so in this example, the researcher was looking to assess knowledge, and they wanted to identify whether the work they had seen as a priority was actually relevant to the community. So that's why I circle the word relevancy here. So they merely wanted to see if it resonated with the community, but there really wasn't a lot of exchange. It was on a consultation basis. The next level up of community engagement is involvement. And so this is more of the participatory form of communication, where it's bidirectional communication, and the entities cooperate with each other. And here I circle the word of setting community priorities. So this is more where there's an exchange of information, and it's more than just finding out if the work that a researcher envisions resonates with the community, but there's more dialogue that happens. And so it's more looking at seeing if the priorities of the researcher are also the priorities of the community. The next stage up is collaborate. And with collaborate here, I have circled the word collective negotiation because there's more bidirectional communication with this particular level of engagement. And this study, or this example of this research article, represents that. A next step up is the shared leadership. And here, I said this was more of the gold standard for community-based participatory research, where it's community and academic partnerships. There's a strong partnership that's formed, and final decision-making happens at the community level. And an example of that would be some type of coalition. And so that's why I circle the word coalition here. That would be representative of what shared leadership looks like. And then at the community level, which I identify as what is most optimal for the community, this is actually an example of a project that is community-led and community-driven, and is represented by the community member group that this article is used to represent. That is a coalition of many different, or a partnership of many different community organizations, and there really is no academic influence in this particular example. So this is really just an opportunity for you to see what the different levels of increasing community engagement looks like and how that actually plays out in academic research. So I also mentioned that my research has a heavy emphasis on capacity building. And this is a term that is frequently used in the literature, but much less is it actually operationalized. So I chose to apply a theoretical lens to capacity building and to use the community capacity theory that I mentioned earlier to provide an organized understanding of what capacity building actually looks like. And so again, this framework has the 10 dimensions on the side that you can see, the 10 dimensions of community capacity that represent a community's power and structures that can be modifiable, as well as can be leveraged to solve collective problems. This theory helps us to better understand what kind of resources are needed, how they can be identified, and how communities can mobilize to accomplish their goals. These 10 dimensions are not considered to be an exhaustive list, but they can serve as a starting point to assess capacity and the strengths as well as the weaknesses in those areas that need to be improved upon at the community level. So again, as I mentioned previously, that there are 10 dimensions, and I'll go through them very shortly. Many of the dimensions are self-explanatory. So citizen participation is really providing community members with an opportunity to engage and be involved in the research. Community history is applying an understanding of the physical or the social or the psychological and economic as well as political dynamics and history of a particular community, because this can affect a community's ability to move forward. Community power represents the ability of a community to have control over decision-making. Community values represents shared norms and standards and understandings within a community. Critical reflection represents the ability to look at the successes as well as the limitations of work that has been done in the past, as well as work that is presently occurring. Leadership is an opportunity for individuals in a group or one dynamic person in a community to take direction and encourage participation among their constituents in the community. Resources looks at financial capital, traditional capital, fundraising and grants, as well as social capital, which is the sharing of knowledge and skills. Sense of community talks more about a shared emotional connection within the community. Skills identify specific skills that can be used that are used in the community to train community leaders or creating opportunities for community members to exchange expertise. And then lastly, social and organizational networks are informal or formal partnerships that could be a community group or a coalition. These are all important components of community capacity. And so if a particular research study or when someone is working with the community is able to identify the presence or the absence of some of these dimensions of community capacity theory, you could then be able to better help the community to identify as well as strengthen their ability to address any of the environmental challenges that they are experiencing in their communities. So in my review, I wanted to identify the degree to which any and all of the dimensions of community capacity were present. And so here I used the capacity building activities that were mapped to each of the 10 dimensions, as I mentioned in the previous slide. In a further observation of these dimensions, you can see that the research studies that were included in my review, many of them had a high level of what I'm referring to as basic engagement. So many participated in citizen participation, networks, community power, leadership, and sense of community. And then there were less frequently documented activities, such as a focus on resources, community history, critical reflection, skills, and community values. So I noticed a natural divide from what I consider these commonplace activities and those that were less frequently documented activities. The first set of activities was commonplace, and it focused on participation such as offering incentives or giving money in appreciation for someone completing a survey. There was also sense of community, so that was embedding the research in an existing community structure, as well as creating some type of partnership, which here is identified as networks. The dimensions that comprise these commonplace activities, from my understanding in the literature and the ways in which the researchers describe their work, I feel that it was a very limited approach to community engagement and utilize the characteristics of the community that I consider are very surface level. And so that's why I refer to them as basic engagement. Many of the ways in which these dimensions were captured placed a heavy emphasis on academic priorities to achieve these research outcomes. But in contrast, the second set of activities that are over here, these were less frequently documented, yet they focus on deep engagement. About half of the articles highlighted activities related to resources. And as you may think this is somewhat odd because I've placed a category where 55% of the articles actually mentioned some type of resources. I placed it in the less frequently documented or deep engagement side of my two sets of activities. And this is because many research studies in the US tend to have greater access to financial capital to support their programming. And so that's why I believe this dimension was present among many of the studies. But resources also speaks to shared social identities and bonding and bridging relationships that are instrumental for sustainability and achieving goals. And for this reason, I categorize it as a deep engagement activity. There was also little attention given to activities that relate to understanding the root causes, which are related to community history, offering any type of technical assistance or skills development under the skills category, or an alignment of the research with community values and community priorities. These less frequently documented activities, I believe, require greater intention and investment and really demonstrate the activities that allow for deeper engagement, as well as alignment with community priorities and understanding of community context and supporting community development. Lastly, I wanted to understand how the research priorities were related to any sort of environmental or policy change. And I was able to identify the following. What I believe is most important about this slide, and I'll focus on this 61%, is that when you look for with these research studies that were specifically focused on air, land, or water pollution, only 61% of them had no impact in the environment. And when you look at the policy-related outcomes, there was also very minimal impact with respect to any type of policy-related outcome. And so I think largely that this is unfortunate. And I'll talk a little bit more about this, and we can exchange also about this in our discussion section. So when I think of community capacity as a lens to address environmental justice. I think capacity is a word that is often cited in the literature as a means to address health disparities and environmental concerns through mobilization. It is absolutely essential for development and maintenance of effective health promotion and intervention work. It helps to better understand the kind of resources that are needed, how they are identified, and how communities can mobilize to accomplish their goals. And it really stresses the importance of knowledge, transferable knowledge, and skills, and systems, and resources that can ultimately affect and impact a community and individual changes. And so in using community capacity theory, I've been able to add more structure to the conversation of capacity building, so that when someone says the word capacity, it doesn't have to be so vague. There can be more of an understanding, a cohesive understanding of what capacity actually looks like. And that is my purpose in using the community capacity theory with the 10 characteristics that are described as ways that you can enhance a community. So unfortunately, across the included articles in my study, there was a less common observation of authentic engagement or shared priorities or community development and sustainability efforts. There were very limited articles that actually described how to strengthen capacity beyond those surface level activities of offering incentives and providing education or aligning research with existing community structures or creating partnerships. And I believe that EJ research efforts really need to consider the deeper capacity building strategies with the potential for collaboration that not only focuses on the priorities of the academic researcher, but most importantly, the needs of the community. So a focus on empowering the community to potentially overcome environmental inequities and then be able to sustain by empowering the community, you would help them to be able to realize their potential to sustain whatever changes that they want to see. I think that true, authentic community engagement is absolutely of value. It is an intentional process, and it's one that is talked about often in the realm of environmental justice and in the space of EJ work. But it's not practiced as much as it should be. Authentic engagement is really grounded in building partnerships and building relationships based on respect and acknowledges the added value of working together in partnership. It is a very intentional process, and I want to focus on the intentionality of this process because I think often from an academic perspective, we can be very focused on our research and the finish line or the finish goal for our particular study. But I think it's important that we intentionally identify with the communities that we are working with and work and understand that our work can have true impact and sustainability if we also educate the community along the way and provide them with the knowledge and the skills and the partnership that's needed to really alleviate many of these environmental health stressors. Engagement also allows for the identification of shared values and priorities and can have alternative perspectives. I believe that communities have lived experience and expertise to create these solutions and can be very insightful and impactful from academics. A leader and someone who is an expert does not necessarily have to have a degree in a particular field. A community member can have lived experience that can be just as impactful and insightful and important for creating the changes that they want to see in the community. Engagement is also about sharing the decision-making power, and it builds trust. And it's focused very much on equity and social justice. And so these research findings suggest that increased engagement can be very impactful in building community capacity, as well as driving policy change. And lastly, my work has shown that many academic studies are not moving the needle as much as we want in making these policy or community changes. And although this may not always be the focus of our research, I believe that we need to take a look at our work as academics and identify if we are truly engaging and valuing the community in a way that is most beneficial for them. I believe that the more that our research aligns with the values and the needs of the community, the greater our impacts can actually be realized. And that's my last slide. So thank you very much for your time. I look forward to having more discussion about what you think about this topic and how useful it is for the work that you're doing, and how we see our work moving forward in this field. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Dana, for your excellent presentation. I think you have reached much more people than we thought in the beginning. Your work is very, very interesting, including for us that are trying to develop or to insert such strategies in our projects. Now, pessoal, perguntas. Como sempre, vocês podem abrir o microfone, se puderem, se quiserem, e fazerem suas perguntas. Podem também colocá-las aqui. Aqueles que estão acanhados podem tentar fazê-las em português. Digo de antemão que tenho grandes dificuldades de traduzir, mas tem outras pessoas que podem nos ajudar, perfeito? People are still thinking about their questions. I have one question regarding that high value of 61%, if I'm not mistaken, that no policy, no changes have been successful, let's put like this, acquired or established. In that high value, is it possible that is a consequence of state or enterprises not hearing such demands or things like that? Would you comment on that, please?
Sure. I think that that high percentage, so much of the research that I looked at, many may not have been focused on making that type of change. And so I think often as academics, we're trained to do research and do studies and interventions. And unfortunately, a large portion of our work does not have a policy change focus, but it absolutely should, because otherwise we're doing this work, and I think many academics maybe don't see themselves as being advocates or activists in this field. But I think I have a different perspective in that the work that I'm doing, I want to ultimately push to see the changes in the communities that are needed and that are necessary. And so I think that maybe it's a lack of priorities or a lack of shared values with much of the research world, and actually those, or a lack of sharing values with the community.
Yeah, understood. Any question? Rita has a question here. I'll try to translate.
Okay.
Let's see if I can do it, because I'm awful for translations. I'm sorry for that.
No problem.
So the question of Rita de Cassia was how you've been faced the organization of the communities for public policies, and how can you see that in face of a new perspective related to it put also in English now. Can you see the question on your screen? Okay.
I'll read it. So I think that Peter's question relates to, so how communities place the production of public policy and positions in the face of new
How
perspectives.
the organization of community has been taking place, the production of the public policies effectively.
Well, there are, so with some of my work that I did not share today, there is the Environmental Protection Agency had an environmental justice academy. And in this academy, it was a leadership development training for community advocates and activists and some academic folks as well, to be trained on how to push for the changes that they wanted to see in their communities. And so there is, and there may be other programs like this around the country, but what I can see is that currently the EPA is a front runner. And I know that the US EPA definitely gets doesn't have the best history for many, but they are doing some good in the community, and they have a leadership training academy that helps to instill these skills and knowledge among those coming from different and having different environmental justice concerns, to help them shape how they can engage with other politicians, how they can engage with their communities to better advocate for the changes that they want to see. So on the academic side, as I mentioned in my presentation, I feel like there is very much a lack of shared values. And so instead of a focus on academia, this leadership training academy focuses on the community members and values their expertise by their lived experiences, and also teaches them how to have these conversations with the people in their city or in their county to help move towards the changes that they want to see in their neighborhoods. And there has been some limited success with this program. It's only been around for about 4 years, and so it is a work in progress, but I see it as being a great way for community members to be more involved, as well as a way to help them to develop the skills and the knowledge that is necessary to help push for the changes that they want to see in their environment.
There is another question from Francisco Barros. Can you check on that, please?
Sure. So I agree. You call it, thank you, Francisco. You say academic vampirism. I also think of it as helicopter science, where an academic person helicopters in to collect their data in a community and then helicopters out with the information, and the community never benefits from it. So yes, there are many academic researchers that also have connections and partnership and work closely with communities, but there may continue to be a disconnect where the community is often or may be leaning too heavily on the academic, and the academic may put themselves on a pedestal where the community doesn't feel like their expertise is actually of value. And so when I think about those 10 characteristics of capacity building that I mentioned in my presentation, I think those can be extremely effective in ways that, from an academic perspective, we can identify how our research is impacting the community. If we look at not only just having the community participate, but how is my work helping to, how is my work aligning with the values in the community? How am I helping people come together with a sense of community? How is my work building the skills and the knowledge of the members in the community? How is my work not only looking at this one point in time, but how is it looking at the history of what this community has experienced so that I can move forward and help to push forward the changes that are necessary. So I also mentioned that there needs to be intention. And so this is something that requires a lot of effort. And I think that there needs to be more intention and attention that is placed on capacity building so that communities can also benefit from the research that we're doing in the academic space, and we can do more partnerships together. Okay, I see another question. Thanks, Hita. Hold on a second.
Yeah, it's my question. Are several surveys using CBPR funded by the government in USA and here also? Do you think that the community have complete confidence in the partnership, in this participation with the university, despite of this? Do you think that the financial influence this relationship?
I do. Well, so I guess in the United States, and that's my only context that I can speak of, but I know that this is probably the way that much research is conducted around the world. Community-based participatory research, CBPR, is work that requires more time and investment. It requires partnership. And many entities that fund research want to see their results right away. And so, unfortunately, CBPR work is not valued at the same level as maybe an epidemiological study where someone can go in and take the data and then be able to look at the results right away. And so, unfortunately, I think we are slowly moving towards CBPR being a more commonplace and recognized for its value in partnership and community building. But unfortunately, the funding stream in the US does not match that. There is work that's being done, and there are foundations that fund much of this research. It's not always government, so I can think of the Casey Foundation, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and the larger government entity is National Institutes of Health, NIH, is where a lot of funding comes from. And so often the priorities of the funders dictate how the research is being conducted, or the way in which the research is being conducted. And if the funder wants to see results right away, oftentimes CBPR work is not what is valued or what is implemented as often. And so, yes, so the latter part of your question is, do I think that the financing influences, the financing influences the type of research? I'm not sure that the financing would influence the relationship, though. The relationships that a researcher or academics have with the community would really be more of an investment of their time, and it might require them to step outside of what their funding stream or the money that they have for their research for the greater good of building partnership with community. So I think it may influence, but I'm not sure if it has a heavy influence on the relationship. And yes, I agree. We have many challenges ahead.
Thank you, Ben.
Aren't there any other questions? So then I'll ask another one, if you allow me. It's a question that I haven't been part of it, but it occurs sometimes in the field, for instance, of vaccination and also in sanitation. Some specific communities, I'm not telling you that some studies or some work, community-based, have been carried out in such communities, but I have been in communities that do not want to have either vaccination nor public sanitation. And when we are faced with such strong decisions from organized communities, what is the solution? To wait until the community faces losses because of this wrong decision, or to work against the community with public instances to implement such decisions regardless of the community will?
So I think I can answer your question as well as that of Rafael, that talks about environmental racism. In the United States, there is a history of the misuse of science and the misuse of medicine, and many do not trust doctors, and they don't trust scientists, or they don't trust researchers coming into their neighborhoods. Much of the history that most people reference is the Tuskegee syphilis study in the US, but there is a far greater history of medical mistrust and science mistrust in communities. So I think the way to address this is really, I think, as I mentioned, it requires patience, and it requires intention. So I come to this space and I'm interested in environmental justice and environmental research because it is very personal to me. And I am personally concerned about my community, and I also have an academic interest. So I come to this work in knowing that in order to be most meaningful in the community, I have to build trust. And that trust can be built within my professional academic space, but it can also be built in my personal space. And so I am then able to build trust in a particular community and leverage these relationships that I have that can then be most impactful for the health of that community. So it requires building relationships so that the community can learn to trust you. Otherwise, as an outsider, you're just an outsider, and I would also be hesitant to just trust someone because they put on a hat and say that they're a doctor or that they're a researcher. I need to make sure that the work that someone is doing is really vested in my personal and my community interests, and they really value my life, and they value wanting to help me make that change. And so often there is that disconnect with an academic researcher and the community that they're researching, because they're researching on them instead of with them, and that's a big difference. And so again, to try and alleviate and encourage vaccinations and encourage sanitation, and also reduce environmental racism, and then the perspective that communities have of researchers, it requires building relationships. I think that that's what is at the core of building trust.
Lovely. Rafael has a question. Environmental racism is very strong here in Brazil. Do you think that science can play an important role in land reform and also reducing environmental racism?
I think my response to my last question was a combination of both your question and Rafael, in that really building trust in the community is one way of being able to address environmental justice concerns. I think science absolutely can play a role in reshaping how these inequities influence communities and community health. There has been a history, as we all know, over the past 4 years in the United States, where science and knowledge generation and scientific facts have not been valued to the degree that they should be. And I hope that we are moving towards a change in that space, because science is a way of moving forward. And actually, we have a long history of knowing that there are disproportionate exposures among low-income and communities of color, and these are the communities that are most impacted by environmental inequities and most experience environmental racism. And now, in this time of COVID-19, coronavirus, in the US and everywhere, I think the communities that in the past have been hidden, where people don't pay attention to them, those are the ones that are being most impacted today. And I don't think we can hide from the fact that racism and environmental racism plays a significant part in how and why there are so many lives that are being lost because of coronavirus. And many of these communities are also the ones that are experiencing heavy burdens of environmental racism.
Is there any other questions, please? Provided that there are no other questions, I would like again to thank Dana for your excellent presentation and contribution. Well, I'm not sure about the others, but I'm quite sure about myself that it has been a very important contribution, because we have been trying to work some transdisciplinary ways, and your work confirm the necessities that we have to let to be a scientist and be more a member of the community. I think that's the message that you put through, and it's a very strong and important message. So what I'm going to do now is I'll pass the word to Rita for her final words, and then I will ask you to close down your presentation, and after that, we will end our session. So thank you very much, and Rita, now you have the word.
Thank you, Dana. I loved heard you again because during your dissertation presentation, your dissertation, I loved, and I'd like to have again another section with you because I think you didn't talk all of your dissertation because of the time. We decided to make a short, only one part of your dissertation, but I'd like to have your presentation for all talks in the future, maybe next year, because probably we have more time for at least for the first semester. Do you know our president is a bad president, you know. And Brazil is probably we didn't receive vaccines or the end before the of this year, the next year, probably. So probably we have more time to stay in office, out of the school, face to face in the school, stay at home yet, for at least for one semester. And have to invite you again for another big section next, if you are available, of course. And I love to hear you again, and thanks for spend your time with us. I think now we in Brazil we discuss on environmental racism is very recent here, and we need more experience in many aspects that I know that you in the United States I saw for when in the time you were there. I heard many times about this topic, but here we discuss only a little, at least now. So so that's that's why I love to have your presentation. Unfortunately, we didn't translate for Portuguese. So that's why we would like to have your presentation in English for the record, for translate some aspects. Of course, not all of aspects, but I'd like to discuss this topic and our partner, especially for the communities, because they don't understand English. Most of them don't understand English, and I invite them, but it's very difficult to understand in English for them. So that's why we would like to have this. For example, today we have a section every week with an observatory of fishermen. We discuss many aspects about the observatory, but today we have this section, so they didn't come, unfortunately. So I'd like to have your presentation for discuss with them. Okay. Thank you. And I'd like to invite you to come to Brazil.
Well, thank you. Yes, I will absolutely accept that invitation. I would love to come back to Brazil. And it would be my pleasure to talk again with you about some of my other research. And also, I think someone had mentioned wanting to see my paper. So it is.
I have already sent to him your
Oh,
paper.
you did? Okay, good.
I have already done.
Right, because it's open access, which was very important. I wanted to make sure that I published in that space.
I send that to everybody.
Okay, great.
Okay. Then your last words, please.
Well, thank you so much today. It really is a pleasure to be able to share my work, and the work of environmental justice and alleviating environmental racism is really an interdisciplinary topic. And so me as a behavioral scientist, public health researcher, I definitely want to have more of these conversations with those that even aren't in my area of expertise, because it's only through our collaboration and partnership together that we can work to alleviate many of the injustices that are experienced around the world. So again, thank you so much for your time today. It was really a pleasure to be here with you and share my work.
Well, thank you very much for your talk. Thank you very much for the audience. And please be aware of our last seminar that will happen next Wednesday with Paul Fernandez from the World Fish Migration Foundation, that will be talking about dismantling dams and let the rivers flow again next week. Thank you very much. Muito obrigado pela atenção de todos. Estou encerrando esta apresentação. Um abraço.